Hi, Elvis friends. I'm Mary.
And I'm Sophia, and welcome to episode 2 of Elvis What Really Happened.
Today we are going to be discussing chapters 5 through 8.
The first chapter we are going to be focusing on is chapter 5.
Okay. Chapter 5. Girl, what a wild ride, honestly.
It's rough.
Literally it is. And this story isn't talked about a ton. So when I was reading it, I was just like, that was sticking in my mind. I was like, wonder why this isn't talked about a lot.
Right, because I feel like I've definitely heard a version of the story in something I've read, but all that comes down to it is this book is just so exaggerated that you can't really tell what in stories is the full truth. So
Exactly. I know we were talking about this before, but for everyone listening right now, we were just talking about how this book is literally written for shock value. That is the purpose of it. And you have the right to make up your own opinion, based off of what we say, based off of what you read in the book. It doesn't matter. That's what we're doing. We're making up our own opinion, but our opinions are based not only on this book. They're based off of multiple sources and years of research and insight into Elvis's life. So even if you agree with this story, that's fine, but we're just saying why we think that there might be more to the story that we're not hearing.
Exactly. So basically, this story is just about a girl that her name wasn't used in the book, but they called her Jane Robertson. And she was singled out in the audience by Elvis. In the book, they claim that Elvis started to give her a couple pills to give her a lift. And at 3 a.m, he produced a bottle of Vicodin.
Vicodin, yeah.
And that is normally prescribed by doctors for severe cases of coughing and congestion. Elvis and Jane both took it that night, and Elvis miscalculated the dosage, and the guys called a doctor, and they said they needed an ambulance for Jane, but Elvis kept saying she was okay, and apparently Sonny claims that Elvis was telling everyone it had nothing to do with him. And so that's a little interesting to me. And they say the girl went sort of crazy after she gained consciousness, and Sonny doesn't remember him ever making a telephone call to Jane or ever visiting her or even acknowledging her existence for a long time. And so this story just reminds us both a lot of Scylla's story back in the early 60s at Graceland.
By Scylla's story, we're talking about, if you ever read Elvis and May, there's a story where she was visiting him over the Christmas holidays, and he gave her some pills out of good intentions. He's like, this will help you relax, this will help you go to sleep. Keeping in mind, Elvis had full confidence in what he was taking and also what he was giving other people to take. He saw it as something to help, and he didn't see how it could be harmful to you, as well as a lot of other people during the 70s, because girl, not that much was known about prescription medication back then. But yeah, so Elvis gives Priscilla these 2 sleeping pills, and it was a really big dose for her. It was obviously fine for him because he'd been taking it for a while, and body immunity and things like that happen, and natural resistance or something, those kind of things, but it was too much for Priscilla, and she ended up being passed out for a couple of days. And obviously he didn't intentionally mean for that to happen. He was giving those pills to her to help her relax and being this will help you just calm down and have a good night's sleep, just like it did for him. So me and Priscilla, girl, no, me and Sophia both we both kind of we're thinking of that story as we read this. And I also do think it's interesting that Sonny says that he spent a lot of time with this woman during the engagement. So he got to know her. It wasn't just a random strange woman that he brought up into his room. It's here, let's take a drink of this. It'll blah, 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 help you with this. So I was thinking, what does Elvis do when he knows someone? He tries to take care of them, and we'll never know based off of this book, but based off of past events, Elvis gave medication to women when they would complain or when they would seem tired or to keep them awake with him. He never forced them to take anything. And Sonny even says this in this chapter, that she willingly took them. whether that was to look good in front of Elvis or because she like thought these drugs could do no harm, just like he thought. We'll never know because that's not the way that the story was told in the book.
Right. And they had to keep up with his lifestyle. So he was probably like, if you guys want to take this to go to sleep or, you know, to wake up or whatever, I bet it was all out of good intentions. Like, these girls are not used to Elvis's schedule of, you know, sleeping all day and being up all night, you know, till the early morning.
Right, exactly. And I think like intentions were exactly like that. Like I think that he had good intentions and things that worked for his body. Like he'd been taking drugs for a long time. So what he needed to go to sleep is probably not something that a person who has never taken a sleeping pill will need to go to sleep. So it's, and I think it's also very interesting. I quoted, there's a quote from, I think it's Sonny in the book that says, Elvis was very skilled when it came to measuring out drugs. He knows those drugs better than a doctor. So that was proof that Elvis most likely gave these to her for a reason and would never give them without knowing what he was doing, because he was very confident and proud in his knowledge and prescriptions and medication. Like we all know the story of his like physician's desk reference and like how he took great pride in knowing what he was doing, or at least thinking that he knew what he was doing. So I don't think like that he gave these to her with like, well, she'll overdose and like this will be really like bad for her and like really funny, or like just not like a motive of like not caring what happens to somebody, you know?
Right, exactly. And I think ultimately the reason, like, if it is all true what they're saying in this book, that Elvis was pretending it wasn't his fault, like he wasn't involved, like he was probably thinking like, wow, like I feel really bad for this girl, but at the same time, my image is on the line. Like, what if this girl says something like I should keep my distance? But
Right.
never ended up saying anything about it. And Sonny or Joe said this in the book. I couldn't really totally tell, but it says the point was because Elvis had this image of being so anti-drug, the girl and the mother didn't want to destroy that image. The girl, Jane, she loved Elvis, man. Do you know, I believe that even if her daughter had died, the mother still would have kept her mouth shut. So if they're saying that's true in the book, like I'm just basing it off of that and then what we have personally looked into. It kind of comes in all full circle.
I agree. And I agree with you. Like, I think it's so fishy, like in the book, that they're saying like the girl admitted it was her fault that she kept taking the drugs and that it wasn't Elvis telling her to keep taking it. They literally quote her in the book saying that she said that. They, in the book, detail that the mother didn't like take any money from Elvis. Like, she wasn't worried about like publicly like saying like, oh, this man tried to hurt my daughter. Like, she refused to do that.
Right.
And they all just like blame it on like the fact where they were like brainwashed almost. They're like, these people were like really nice, but they would never say anything to hurt Elvis's image. But like, girl, like if a mother normally thought that like her daughter was hurt by somebody else, she absolutely 100% would have tried to get justice for her daughter. So I don't think like that's even, it's like just thinking about it logically, like would that really happen? Would a mom be like, no, I love Elvis too much, I don't want to take your money? Like, what?
Right. And it's like, even in the book, they said that they went to another concert and they slept in their car and Joe or somebody was trying to offer them money and all that jazz. So, like, would they really go to another Elvis concert, like, supporting what he's doing if they really held something like that against him? And you'd think after that dramatic and traumatic of an experience that you would, you know, take action a little bit more.
I definitely agree. So that was just something that didn't sit right with, I think, both of us in that chapter. But that's kind of what the whole chapter was about. So take it with what you will, you know. I mean, for me, and I don't want to speak for Sophia, but I take that story with literally a grain of salt, because this book, like I said before in the beginning of the video, is written for shock value. And this book is comprised of sensationalism and things written in a very specific way to make Elvis look a very specific way. And so keeping that in mind, I'm not going to take this book as gospel or use it for reference or anything, because I simply just don't believe its contents fully, you know, like without backstory and context.
Same here, girl, because at the end of the chapter, they say this, which personally, like, very much boils my blood. They say, I never heard Elvis talk about her again. By 1971, Elvis was a changed guy. He was no longer the shy, fun-loving kid from Memphis. No, he was just living for himself and all that junk he took. He was like a walking drugstore. So that in itself just shows, like, the shock value they are trying to gain from how they word this book. And it's
Right.
just, like, downright disrespectful. Like,
It really is. And just to degrade Elvis down to saying that he was so selfish, he was just living for himself, that is so ironic, because literally, if you know anything about Elvis, you know that everything that he was doing was for somebody else. Like, he was living his whole life singing for other people and paying for everybody to work for him. Like, he was he was working to pay to provide for people and provide for his fans. And like, the most unselfish kind of motivated man I literally have ever learned about. Because if you learn about what's going on with his body, if he was just living for himself, girl, he would have fully quit. Like, he would have been like, if he's living for himself, like, girl, I don't feel good today, I'm not going out there and singing. Like, I can't do that. But he had obligations to multiple different areas of life that he felt like was more important than himself. So he pushed himself.
Right. Like, he took these drugs for a reason. Like, yeah, maybe he overdid it, but he felt like he needed to. His body went through so much. And people, honestly, back in 1977 did not know half, even a quarter of the things that we do now.
Exactly. And like you said, like, we all know Elvis took drugs, and we all know it became a problem and it spiraled out of control. But why was he taking them? And why did he start taking them in the first place? Like, you cannot understand this stuff unless you understand those questions first.
Yep, the why questions are honestly the most important questions to answer when you're researching Elvis. That is for sure.
Absolutely, girl, 100%. Should we move on to chapter 6?
Yes.
All right. Okay, so chapter 6, this chapter basically just talks about the Presley family's move from Tupelo to Memphis. It talks a lot about Elvis and Gladys's relationship, and then it talks a lot about, like, Elvis, like, growing up, whether he was spoiled or, like, treated differently from the other kids. And then they talk a lot about Jesse in this section, and just about how, like, this, like, very strong bond that Elvis must have had, or something he was missing from having that bond with Jesse since he died. So that's chapter 6. Sophia, what did we feel?
Honestly, when I was reading this, I was like, wow, they are really trying to glorify Elvis and Gladys's relationship when they honestly just had a very strong bond. And I don't see why it's so, like, it holds so much controversy and everything, when they just loved each other. They were a close family. Their family went through a lot of, like, hard experiences together, and they stuck together. Like, and I think that's so special, and they make it seem so weird and out of the ordinary. Like, what?
Definitely, like, just that whole relationship between Elvis and his mom, as if, like, loving your mom and a mom loving her son. And even in the book, they, like, talk about, like, how he was playing outside and Gladys would, like look out the window to make sure he was okay. Like, as if that's literally, like, being an overprotective parent. Like, I know from experience, like, my mom would look out and check on me, or make sure, I had what I needed, or like, a parent who loves their child cares about their child. And I think, like, they talk a lot about Jesse, but, like, losing a child, right? Like, especially during childbirth, and then having Elvis survive, I think that definitely factored into, like, how Gladys viewed her family. Like, she was very grateful for Elvis because he was her baby, like, that made it from the birth. And she was probably very, she was protective in a sense, because that was her only child. Like, and going through a traumatic event such as losing a child during birth, like, you would want to make sure that the child who survived was okay. But I don't think, like, that should be sensationalized. Again, like you were saying, like, a mother loving her son and making sure he's okay and having everything that he needs is not, like, it shouldn't be like, oh, like Elvis and his mom had such a weird relationship just because they cared about each other.
Right. And even in the book, Mrs. Faye Harris, apparently a friend of the Presleys in Tupelo, had to say she worshipped that child from the day he was born until the day she died, which I feel like they could have used a way different wording than that. Like, worshipped is a very strong word.
Mm.
Like, you could simply just say loved and cared for, like, her child until the day she died. But no, they had to use that very, like, how do you even say it? Like, over dramatic wording. That's literally what this book is. So,
literally. And that gets me so good. Like, as if they're saying that for like shock value. Like, some people, like some women, all they want out of life is a family and like people to care for. And once you are a mother, if you're not a mother, this book is written by men. Like, this book is written by like a male. Like, unless you're a mother, you will not understand that, like, that love that you have for your babies. Like, it is very true. Literally, I'm talking from my mom right now because she's told me this so many times, but like, her family is her life. Like, her kids are her life. And so saying like she worshiped that child from the day, like, I'm sure she did, girl. Like, maybe worshipped isn't the right word, but I'm sure Elvis was her life, like, period.
right, exactly. And that's just that. Like, there's nothing really more to cover on it because it's just very shock value vibes that we're not living for. So, um,
Agreed. Agreed. I think they like make the Elvis and Gladys. Everybody always takes that story and tries to make it into something like so sensationalized, just
yeah,
to like dehumanize him even more. Like, oh, he had this really weird relationship with his mom. Like, no, he didn't. He just loved his mom and she loved him. And like, it does not need to be like dissected in the way that people are doing.
exactly. Then the book kind of delves into like, and it says like Elvis could be considered a spoiled child, certainly by comparison with the kids he grew up with. And honestly, Elvis was an only child. Like, he might have like gotten more attention than a
Mm.
lot of kids had, you know. And but honestly, materialistic wise, I don't think so, because if you look in the pictures of what was he like in the 5th or 6th grade, and there's a photo in front of the school, and he was wearing overalls and all these other kids were wearing these nice clothes. So like, if you really look at it from that view, he was, out of like the ordinary for a lot of the kids and what they had.
Exactly. Like, just because, like, you could be poor but like still have love, and I feel like that's what Elvis talks about that a lot. Like, we didn't have everything that we wanted, but we always had what we needed. And so maybe he didn't have like the best clothes or like the best, the fanciest house or whatever, which is very obvious. So saying that he was a spoiled kid is not true. But he had like a good home life. He had parental love and he had things like he had clothes on his back and like a clean house to go home to. And I think like it also speaks like to when he got older and he used to work a job just so that he could buy the clothes that he wanted, because like growing up he had to wear overalls and like button down shirts. And then you like hear him talk about how he never really wanted to wear jeans again because it would bring back like those days where he was made fun of for the clothes that he wore. So saying like he was spoiled with material things, like, that's just not true.
Certainly not. Like, he tried so hard to dress the way he wanted to dress, and that often just gets looked at as like he was just the weird, like, awkward kid that wanted to be different. Like, no, like, he did not want to relive those moments where his family was as poor as could be. And it was probably just very traumatic to look back on it and be like, wow, like, I didn't have anything back then, but like, look at me now. Like, I can now like hold up things for my family and support them and all of that stuff. So it's like, if you really look at it, I've never, been in that situation before, but I feel it for a lot of people like him who experienced that same thing.
Exactly. Exactly. That's such a good way to put it too. Like, unless you really like went through it, you'll never really know. Like, we never will experience or have experienced getting picked on because our clothes were different, or or like not as fancy as like the other kids or something like that. And so I can definitely see how Elvis would just like want to be dressed nice, and like there's nothing wrong with that, and give his parents, like you said, like just like a nice house. Like when he bought Audubon, that was a huge deal for him, because like he just wanted to be able to provide and have a sense of normalcy in his life.
Right. And then throughout this chapter, they bring up a lot of Jesse and saying that like he is like missing a part of him because his like twin brother was never like there. But the thing, Elvis never got to experience that with his twin brother. Like I get it, like that must have been really tough for Gladys especially, but a lot of people in the inner circle say that Elvis rarely to barely ever talked about it at all, and they didn't know for a very long time that he had like a twin brother, you know.
Right, yeah, exactly. And like I think we have quoted in our notes here that Red was Elvis's companion, friend, protector, the man who watched over him in the same way his twin brother might have had he lived. And I just think that that is like, again, sensationalized, because like Elvis didn't need a constant companion or someone to watch over every move he made or protect him from life. Like he was a grown man capable of handling his own life and fighting his own battles and taking care of himself. And even growing up, like he had two parents that watched over him. He had friends, like all this other stuff. Like he didn't need somebody to like quite literally protect him. Like, so
Yeah.
even twins today, like they don't rely on like each other for constant support, or at least like most don't. Like you don't need your twin to survive life.
No, like Elvis is like the biggest known name around the world. Like he is a historical figure. He did that by himself. Yeah, he had help along the way. Yeah, certain things, you know, pushed him up, but he did that by himself. He didn't need nobody's help. Like, let's be honest.
Exactly. So yeah, I feel like that's along with the Elvis and Gladys thing as well, like the narrative of him like walking to the like river and seeing his brother's reflection in the water and like talking to, I'm just like, stories of Elvis doing just like oh, like just unbelievable things like that. You probably, oh, it's not true, because he didn't, like you say, he didn't even really talk about Jesse that much, so people didn't even know he had like a twin that was like that died at birth. So it's like, let's really just take a second to think about it logically, and also listen to people who were there, because there are a lot of people quoted saying like you said, like we didn't even know he had a twin, or like no, he didn't like stand at the tomb and like or like the gravestone and sing or whatever. Like that's just not even. Yeah,
it has been sensationalized for many, many years. Like if you look at it in the movies and everything, like it's honestly crazy how far they take like and go in the beginning of like Elvis as a kid, like seeming like he was so different than anybody else. Like he was like a loner, like he was missing a part of him. Girl, he had so many people supporting him. And yeah, he was a shy guy. Like we all know that, but it's not like he was longing for his like brother that he never, you know, got to have a relationship with, of course. So it's like, I don't know. It just all doesn't add up to me.
Exactly. And like we're not Elvis, so we don't really know like what he felt deep down about Jesse, but we're just like saying like this really over the top stories of him doing these really over the top things. Like Elvis was a human being just like everybody else, and he let us know that multiple times. Like, I'm just a human. Like there's no supernatural thing about me. Like I'm just a regular guy. So like stories of him doing like really out of the ordinary things, those should be like just like a red flag. Like maybe yes, he did talk about Jesse, or maybe he did like I wouldn't put it past him to like maybe sometimes like while he's praying like talk to Jesse or something like that. Like I know people who do that with a twin that they lost, but there's just certain like stories and like people like putting it in a way where it's like, well, I was his friend because his twin brother didn't survive, and if he did, he would have protected him and watched over him and things like that. I'm just like, he was his own person. He was his own person.
Right. Like he didn't just need Red to, you know, be his companion and friend. Like Elvis had a lot of people supporting him like throughout the years. And I don't think the whole like credit should just go to one person, you know?
Exactly. He had many friends and many like rotations of people in the inner circle.
So next we're going to kind of dive into 7 and 8 as a whole, just because they're very similar and they kind of go off and relate to each other. They first go off and talk about his highs and lows of his personality and moods. And obviously Elvis definitely had those high and low moods. As we talked about in episode 1, we discussed about it a lot. So if you want to like get our full insight on it, like you can definitely go check it out there, but we will kind of summarize it. But basically, if Elvis was in a bad mood, like he was in a bad mood, like he had so many things going on with him, like physically, emotionally. Mary will go into it. Mary, do you want to just go into it right now? Because
I would love to. But yeah, I think like just prefacing saying like everybody in the whole world will have low and high moods. Like everybody will go through like bad days and good days, and that's okay. And that's literally mental health in a nutshell. Like, and some people's mental health is worse than other people's, and some people really struggle with mental health. So like it's just so important to keep in mind. But also what Sophia was saying, like important to keep in mind what things influence mental health, because so much stuff does, like stress. Elvis under so much stress, schedule, like always performing like weird hours, getting no sleep, on medication that has probably, like you think about medication today, prescription medication, you see like a commercial for it and it's like side effects are like throwing up and vomiting and feeling like really, really trash and maybe even death. So you're like, girl, like medications have side effects. So, and he was on a lot of medications. So factor in that. Like there's just so many factors that like go into people having a bad day and like what things that they do on a bad day. If you think about again like Elvis taking drugs and like the side effects, and like him having brain fog, which he literally has admitted to having brain fog. Like when you can't think clearly, you do things that are out of the ordinary, or things that shock people, or things that don't come from like your true self, like the true self of who you are. So just thinking about it again, like our goal is to bring in context and not just like focus on these like hyper sensationalized stories. So I think it's important to talk about that stuff.
Exactly. They kind of tie in his highs and lows of his personality and moods with impulsiveness, which I honestly agree with. Like Elvis, he just, if Elvis wanted to do something, he did it and nobody could stop him, like at all.
Right.
With
Right.
that. There's many stories of him, like of him seeing something on the TV that he didn't like and he just shot the TV. Like, okay, go off. Like
Literally.
do what you will. Like, man had enough money. Like he could replace it. I'm not saying that these behaviors are normal for everyone, because, you know, like Elvis had a lot of money and he could totally replace it in a jiffy, but you know.
Right.
But I just think it all ties in with honestly how much he was going through, because if you think about it, when you are not feeling well and you're just, there's so many things going on in your mind, so much stress, so much pressure. If one thing, especially when I'm in a bad mood, if something just sets it off, like the tiniest thing, I just go off. I'm like done. And I can't imagine how that must have been for him, because I know I will never experience the amount of stress and pressure he was under. So yeah.
Literally, that's such a good point. Like all these things, like side effects of medication mixed with like him. I mean, if you know about his health, which me and Sophia do, like, you know that he literally was feeling trash every single day. His bodily systems were literally failing. Like 9 of the 11 of them were actually in jeopardy and shutting down. And so when you're not feeling good, you're feeling actually so sick. I can't even imagine how bad he was feeling, like with all that stuff going on. And then mixed with like stress, and mixed with like side effects of medication, and mixed with like bad moods, and mixed with like feeling in a rut, or feeling like creativity like being like drained or something like that. Like I just don't even, being an entertainer, or being a superstar, or somebody in the public eye alone is going to create so much stress in your life and so much anxiety. And then having that, like being literally the biggest entertainer in the world, on top of being really sick and not knowing what's going on with your body, on top of taking a lot of medication to try to mask those symptoms. And like, it's just so much, like so much on top of each other. And like you said, like even when I have a cold, like I could have a common head cold and I'll be in a bad mood because girl, I don't feel good and I don't want to deal with anything because I don't feel good. Like it's just, he was a human being with like human struggles, and it is so important to remember that.
Right. Like Elvis, okay, I know everybody literally says this all the time, but like Elvis the image is way far off from Elvis the human. And I think a lot of people just really have to take and put focus to that because, yeah, he was like, he had his uppity times, but he also had the lowest of the low. Like, I cannot imagine, especially in the 70s. Like, the 70s was the time where everything was especially like going downhill health wise.
Exactly, girl. And I think like looking at trying to look at Elvis in a more human light, like you were talking about, means that you have to acknowledge that just because he was Elvis Presley and just because he was like good looking or like a sex icon, all this other stuff does not mean that he didn't have struggles. And by like saying like, well, he was Elvis Presley, there's no way that he smoked because he's Elvis. Like, no, you can't put limits on him and you can't give him rules and like boundaries because he was a man and he was just a human being and he made mistakes. Like, we're not saying he didn't. He made impulsive choices and things that he did a lot of stuff he shouldn't have done. He acted on a lot of, you know, crazy ideas and schemes and things like that. But a lot of stuff played into that. And we do the same thing. Like, there are things I have done in like a moment of like weakness or stress or anxiety or anger or whatever, but that's human nature. And like, everybody goes through that. So like, don't judge somebody else for doing something that is so normal and something that we do as human beings as well.
Right. And if you look at all like the 50s interviews, like when he's asked if he smokes or drink, he says no, like, no, sir, I don't do that. But really, he had to keep up his image. And people are so stuck on the fact of this image that was put out there 45 years ago. And I think it's time to strip away that image, as we all say, and just really take a deep dive because there's a lot more to the story than what's on the surface. So
Agree so much. I agree so much.
So now should we dive into the whole gun situation?
Yeah, let's talk about the guns. Let's they make that a huge deal, don't they?
Oh yeah, they make him seem like very obsessive over them, like very crazy. I don't even know how to word this, girl. Like, it's actually insane.
No, literally. Yeah, they talk about there's a quote that Sophia has in our notes. And they quote it as saying Elvis was absolutely kinky about guns. That's amazing.
And they say that like a couple times in the end too. Like, they really love that word that they found for it, and I was like, okay. But the thing is, Elvis, that was like his source of like protection, and that was his fun. Like, when he got to go out with the guys and like shoot random targets or whatever, like, he was having the time of his life. And if you realize, Elvis grew up in the South, so that was a Southern casualty. Having guns, like a lot of Southern boys would go out and shoot beer cans or targets in the yards for hours, but Elvis literally didn't always have a gun for fun. Like, he had to protect himself. Like, there are like, everyone knows, like, he kept a gun in his boot during a lot of concerts and performances just because he was paranoid that, you know, someone was gonna do something like attack him, or he had many death threats, so he had to be on top of things.
Literally, like, if you think about how many bodyguards he had, like, that was a huge issue for him. And I like how you talked about how like that's a very Southern thing, like, not to stereotype, but like it is like in the South, Girl, even where I live, I don't live in the South. I literally live in Pennsylvania, and like my grandpa collected guns. Like no matter what you like, personally believe about them, like it is a kind of a culture thing. Like it is a Southern casualty. Like Southern boys would go out and shoot beer cans or targets in the yard. Like, but Elvis couldn't go out and shoot things in the yard for fun. Like very rarely, especially in the 70s, he couldn't do that because there was people in his yard 24/7. The fans were always there. He didn't have any place. Like he couldn't go out and sit on like the porch or something without people coming up to him or people at the gates or anything like that. So since he was Elvis Presley, he had to improvise and say like, well, let me shoot a TV or like, let me shoot at mirrors. Like he wasn't shooting at people. He was just having impulsive, crazy fun. And like, he could be silly and dangerous too. Like we shouldn't take that away from him. Like he was just trying to have fun in like any way that he could. And maybe it is weird to us or like, whoa, he shot a TV, but like, girl, yeah, he did. Like he shot a TV. Let's get over it. Like it's not that big a deal.
It really isn't. And it's like, as I feel like I've noticed this, and I've noticed this like in a lot of like books written by fans, is like that Elvis wasn't out at the gates as often in the 70s. Like he did like stop by like on his motorcycle or if he was riding around his car a couple times, but he just needed a way to escape. And especially in the 70s of how much his body was going through, and he suffered from a lot more side effects from the medication, and physically his body was shutting down. So he seeked a lot more privacy and a lot more relaxation because the concerts took a toll on him. Like, let's be honest, he loved doing it, but it really, I don't even know how to say, like, it just helped to the fact of how tired he was and how much his body was quite literally failing him. So
literally, yeah. And you can love something that's like hurting you. Like, I mean, that's all he knew. Like from the early 50s, girl, he was singing, and it's what he loved to do. He loved to make people happy. He loved to give to people, and he was able to do that by being Elvis Presley. So he loved what he did. I think he loved being Elvis Presley, but there was just like obvious like drawbacks to it as well. Like, yes, he loved what he was able to bring to people and like what he was able to give to people, and the feeling that he had like being able to do that, I'm sure he loved that. But at the same time, it was taking over his body and over his life, and like he was never going to have that normal like traditional life that he talked about like in the 50s to his girlfriends, like wanting to get married and grow old together and have lots of children and grandkids and like all this stuff. Like that sinking in for him, I think too, like after going through a divorce, and just not that he couldn't have gotten married again or anything like that, but just realizing like my life isn't exactly going to plan, and it's kind of spiraling out of like control, because it was like his life was literally out of control. And I think like realizing that, I don't think he was oblivious to it, and I think that just could impact a person as well.
right. And exactly, like, weren't they supposed to like fly out on August 16th to go on his next tour? So
Yeah.
he obviously, and there are stories of like him like the night before saying like, you guys, I'm so excited to like go on this tour and all this stuff. So he enjoyed what he was doing, but he also felt the need, he also had to, because he had to make money for his family, as we said earlier in this episode. He just had to. And
Right.
So much stress. Like, honestly, it's all it comes down to is how much he was going through at this time. And there's no blame to point on one person. Then they kind of like go on and say like he has no self-control, hence the gun firing stuff. And then they kind of like say in the book, the old Elvis, when he turned on the charm, he could con anyone. So it's like they make him seem like he didn't have any control over what he did or what he decided to do, and he like changed in the 70s, which obviously over time people are going to change with maturity and age. And it goes for the same for Elvis. Like, he is not going to be the same person at 21 than at 42. Like, let's be honest.
Exactly. And his career wasn't at the same spot either. Like, you have to think like he's been living this lifestyle for years, like decades at this point. So he's gonna change with it. Like, he's not gonna be this person as he was in like high school or when he was just like a young kid just being introduced to fame. Like, he will change and he will adapt, and maybe some of that will be negative and some of that will be positive, but like that's just, again, human nature to change with your environment and your like surroundings and what your life turns into. Okay, guys, so that is all that we have for the 4 chapters for this episode.
We hope you guys enjoyed this episode. If you have any thoughts or opinions on it, please leave it in the comments down below. We would love to hear your guys' feedback.
And we will see you very soon for episode 3 of Elvis, What Really Happened.